Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm very excited to be here speaking with artist Giulia Livi. Her exhibition, Bend Breathe, is on view at the Delaware Contemporary now through May. And we are excited to hear from Giulia today about her work, a little bit about her practice, and the work that's on view at the museum. Giulia, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. All right, I'm going to share some images. All right. So my name is Giulia Livi. I live in Baltimore City. I'm originally from Philadelphia. Currently, I am a studio artist, but I also teach as an adjunct at MICA here in Baltimore, and I also run a gallery space called Grimaldus Gallery. And I want to talk to you a little bit about my practice and then end with some images of the show that's currently up at the Delaware Contemporary. So my work really stems from a few different ideas. I work mostly in large-scale installation with fiber-based objects, painting-based wall sculptures, really any material that I need to use to create the objects that I'm envisioning for this space. My work deals mostly with ideas of interior space and design, and this sort of slightly humorous take on overly curated home spaces or weirdly functional art objects. I think a lot about how objects and artwork exists in the home versus in the gallery or the museum, and how that sort of changes the way we interact with work. And how we sort of design our lives, curate our lives, and exist with these objects in our homes. Some of the inspiration for my work is a basis in mural practice. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so I was always engaging with the mural arts program there and have done mural work here in Baltimore. And so painting at a large scale is just something that's really important to me. I think it really activates the spaces that I work in and allows me to create an immersive experience for the viewer. Beyond that, I'm really interested in private collections. So in grad school, I was able to have the experience to start to go to private collections, and I just found it so interesting and almost absurd to see such high-priced artwork just existing in someone's home, surrounded by the rest of their stuff. It made me think about minimalism in a new way, thinking about what a privilege minimalism can be, to really overly curate your space and exist with high-end artwork. And then what does it mean to have artwork in a middle-class home or a low-class home? What does that sort of change the way that we interact with the work and how the work interacts with the rest of the space? And so as I'm moving through, I'm showing images of past installations. Here was at Arlington Art Center, and I was thinking a lot about viewer interaction with the work, how an art object can be a painting, but also a sculpture, but then also something that can be used. Thinking about the curated home space sort of stems from my personal experience. I grew up in a really overly curated home. My dad collects antiques, and so I was surrounded by these objects that were, aesthetic for him, but just completely unusable for us. And that sort of disassociation between objects that are utilitarian, they were meant to be used, and then just, being in a time period where we were not actually meant to use those objects. I also wanted to add a few images of the studio. So although the work, when it's shown in a gallery or a museum, is an immersive installation, the way that I get to that point is sort of organic. So when I'm working in the studio, I'm always creating collages or other imagery using a collection of found material, and thinking about color and form. I sort of think about objects from history or objects from my memory that are utilitarian or domestic based objects. And if I think about those objects as sort of points in space that are like ever growing into the utilitarian object that we know their name, that's sort of how I create the form. So for example, like if a lamp starts at a point in space, right, and then it's growing into a lamp, what does that in between look like? And so all of the organic forms that I create are meant to be references of a very specific object that I have in my memory. And it becomes an object that's pregnant with the idea of a utilitarian object. So a painting that's pregnant with the idea of a couch or of a chair or of a diner booth, something like that. Um, the lines in the work are meant to sort of reference the painted line, but they're often done with sewing or fiber work, hand-dyed fibers that reference these sort of retro colors that existed in sort of the 60s and 70s interior design landscape. Those are sort of the colors that I grew up with, and so that's what I'm referencing mostly. And then those objects that are meant to reference these utilitarian pieces then are inserted into these painted installations to create sometimes a living room space or a bathroom space, or maybe a floor model for a space that you would see in like an IKEA. And so these objects become sort of interwoven and interchangeable within these different installations, depending on the painting that goes on the wall. So this is an example of objects that were created and then inserted into a mural space. This was at VAE Gallery in Raleigh. So thinking about this idea of the object in the home also made me think about Marka Yu's Places and Non-Places essay from '95. And I'm always thinking about, you know, what is a place, what is a non-place? How do we create artwork that's meant to exist in a really specific place? And what does that control mean for the artist? So if a non-place is a place of transition, is the gallery then that place of transition? It's a place where the work exists only for a short amount of time, and then it moves to the home space. And then what does it mean for the artwork to be in the home space, interacting with objects that it wasn't created to be interacted with? What else? I said that color palette sort of references these retro design elements because I was really interested in design research, which was this sort of boom within the 50s and 60s, where we start to see minimalist objects sort of become design objects and have that minimalism sort of insert itself into the middle class home. And, you know, that design research sort of boomed into what we see now as Crate and Barrel and IKEA and all those sort of big retail stores. And so just thinking about like the history of an object and the way that it is made, what is the difference between a painting you get from an artist and a painting you find at IKEA, and how can we really think about that sort of disassociation and sort of understand from the maker's point of view the fact that your object may exist in a space with those more consumable objects. And so what is the history in that, and how can we sort of insert that knowledge into the creation of the work? I'm also really interested in responding to the spaces directly. So creating work that's meant to be in a very specific corner of a house or a nook and cranny. This exhibition here was a group exhibition that was done in 3 parts with the same 4 artists. So I did this with myself, Doreen McCarthy, Kat Chamberlain, and Brian Michael Dunn. And this was a really unique opportunity because we got to create 3 different exhibitions with the same artist, but different work. And so it was almost like not only were we able to respond directly to the architecture of the galleries that we were working in, but we were also able to respond directly to the work that we were putting in the shows. So it was sort of like creating and curating at the same time. I was really interested in responding directly to the work of the other artists. And seeing how my work would fit in as sort of like a puzzle piece within that space, because that's really how a lot of collectors take in work, right? They're thinking about how it's going to exist in their space with the other work in their collection. And what does it look like when you're thinking about that already in the process of making? So this is the second iteration of the show. I was also thinking about here, this piece specifically was thinking about a radiator and sort of creating that radiator in a soft fabric form to sort of challenge that idea of object use and utility. A few more images from the third iteration of that exhibition. Again, responding directly to the space and creating work that's meant to fit into a very specific corner. And then this is an exhibition that's actually currently on view at Abington Art Center. And here I was thinking again about this idea of like picking out your painting and that experience of, you know, art versus retail and how we can think about it in this sort of subtly humorous and also light way. And then also just thinking about color theory and objects as paintings and paintings as objects. Material use here is traditional painting, but then I'm also thinking about soft versus hard a lot. So I spent a good number of years working with fibers, but then sort of thinking about, okay, how can I turn that fiber into a hard object and then contrast the soft versus hard. And so for these pieces and for a number of the pieces in the Delaware show, they're utilizing fibers, but then also marble dust gessos to create more solid forms. And so that takes us directly to the Delaware show. And here it was a really interesting sort of experience working during COVID and thinking about, okay, what experience do I want to provide to the viewer, knowing that many viewers are going to view this work on the screen because of the nature of traveling right now. But then for those who do decide to go to the museum, what do I want them to feel? And the thing that I just kept coming back to was just like a place of respite. And so this exhibition became less about the individual objects and more about the experience of being in this space. So I painted a sort of low horizon line around the entire space that's meant to be really, really subtle shift from white to blue. And I just wanted a place of respite, a place where you're sort of floating in and out between these ideas of pattern and form, thinking about softness and solidity and yeah, those kinds of things.
Giulia, I know when you were there installing or just after, I had the pleasure of bumping into you, and we did talk for a few seconds about how peaceful the space really felt. And I said, oh, when I come work on site, I'm going to bring my laptop in here. This is going to be my new workspace because my home space has been my workspace for so long. So I feel like there's a lot we could dig into there connected to your work. But you also mentioned like, well, wait and see how you feel once it's lit. Could you talk a little bit about the lighting decision? Because I think it really does impact the overall experience of the work. And maybe if you're seeing it online, you're not getting the full effect of how it feels to be in the space with the lighting choice that you made.
Yeah, so for all of the installations that I do, I prefer to sort of overly light the space. It does sort of add to the subtlety between the shifts of color. because I am really interested in sort of, how do we wear out our eyes and sort of see what other floaters we can create just looking at the work. Um, but there is this sort of simplicity and calmness to the work itself, but I never want the viewer to be too comfortable. So it's sort of like this in-between space of, am I really comfortable here? Or am I in sort of a raw, sterile retail environment? And so it's this sort of balance between desire and consumption. So I want this space. Is it realistic for me to have this space in my house? Probably not. And so, yeah, this sort of like comfortable but uncomfortable sterile is why the spaces are always lit with these as much light as can be accommodated.
I think it's really successful actually, because it does border on when you're in there, you're kind of drawn into the space thinking, this is, oh, what a peaceful and light and kind of ephemeral and airy atmosphere at first when you walk in. But then if you spend a little too much time, you start to think, like, wow, it's really bright in here. Is that just me? Or, no, it is. It's really bright in here. And you start to then look a little bit differently around the space too. But it is very experiential in that it takes a few minutes of being in there and sitting with the work. And then at some point your perception starts to change just a little bit. And I think that's an interesting concept connected to your overall idea of the context of objects. And there's a lot to unpack there with the museum space as a place that presents and changes the meaning of objects. And our object is the seasonal theme right now. So I feel like your work was a perfect fit. And if it's okay, can I do a few Q&A right now? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I think you got me right to the end, so I'll just keep these
Perfect.
images of the show.
It was really interesting to hear you talk about growing up with objects. And I'm thinking of the work of Sherry Turkle, who writes about evocative objects. And hearing you talk about objects as um, touchstones for memory or points in history is really interesting to me. Sherry Turkle asks people to write about an object significant to them. And she asks, what is it? Where can it take us, and how does it make us feel? Is there a particular object that you find yourself going back to over and over again in the work and responding to? And is there a story behind that as a reference point for you?
Yeah, I guess the most direct link, and sort of as I keep this work going, sometimes it's really really direct, and I'm like, okay, this object is this object, and this object is that object, and sometimes it becomes a little bit more fluid. The pieces that have the more round, almost like diner booth shapes are in reference to a chair that I used to sit on when my sister was taking piano lessons. Um, and it was in the rectory of the church in our neighborhood, and it's a really it's really random. Those lessons don't pose any significance to me, but I spent a lot of time in that chair as a child, and it was a pink chair that sort of was shaped like a shell, and it was this like really cheap pink velvet. Um, and it spun. It was a spinny chair, which was very seductive to me as a child. Um, and yeah, I always come back to that because it was so um, the disconnect between the design of that chair and the rest of the rectory was really apparent. And I think it's something that I noticed even as a small kid. It just was so strange that this was like a very sort of 70s design object, surrounded by like this sort of gaudy religious iconography. And it was like light pink. And so yeah, that's an object that I come back to a lot. And then the pieces with lights reference mostly my dad's collection. He collected early lighting. So there was a lot of candlesticks in our house that he would, you know, um, melt the wax to exactly how he liked it, but then you couldn't light the candles anymore to disrupt the wax. And so there's just this sort of like strangeness in objects that we hold dear and like interact with them when they're meant to be used, and sort of see them as um, almost like personalities. I also think about like um, John Waters and his I think it was in 2014, the autobiography is from Role Models. He has a chapter in that book about um, his art collection, and he talks about each artwork in his house as like a person, as like a roommate. Um, and so it's like, yeah, it's like living with something that has personality. Does that sort of answer your question?
Absolutely. And I love that the story behind that chair as a touchstone for you that you keep coming back to in the work. And I think it's interesting to think about the stories and the narratives that visitors bring into the museum and associate with objects, and the stories that they bring from their experience that inform the meaning of what they're seeing on the walls, and the role of the museum space in shifting and kind of changing or dictating that meaning, the context of objects, I think is really important. Um, and I think Be More Art a couple months ago did a really good article on George Sissel's home and collection. And it's so interesting to hear you playing in that concept of objects presented in different contexts in the museum, and then transitioning into a private collection. Could you talk a little bit more about that in your work and either the history of your practice or what you've got going on now?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the private collections that I've been to, they there's just this strange, and I mean, I'm speaking mostly about private collections that are, hold work that to me is like big work, not large scale, but like very important. Um, and so to see objects that I've been fascinated by in textbooks, then on the wall of someone's house who also has, a dog running around, like a silhouette sculpture, right? And just like the preciousness of an object being broken down in a specific way, it makes the object just so much more consumable. It's just like it's a really direct connection between viewer and object. Um, and, coming from a family that is not um, participating in the art world in any way. And so like knowing their experience, coming into a space with art, versus, someone who's really invested in the fine arts coming into a space with art, like what is that accessibility, um, and now I'm sort of losing your question a little bit.
No, that was really great and it's perfect. And I think that that dichotomy is something really interesting. And, as a museum educator, for me, I understand there are lots of barriers to coming into the museum space and experiencing art. And so I constantly go back to the idea of narrative and the story that everybody brings into the space to help them build meaning as they're looking and experiencing things. I think that's why your work is so interesting to me, to hear you talk about those personal stories and then see the work on the wall, which is a very minimal aesthetic that I think sometimes, not in a bad way, but that could be a barrier to people. They don't necessarily quote unquote get it, but the
Right.
idea that you can bring your story to this space and make the meaning from it, I think is really interesting to me and what is exciting about your work.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of like, I think at any level, color theory and minimalism is sort of like immediately seductive, especially when it's blown up into a full space. But then you're sort of like, wait, why do I like this? It's just a blue horizon line, And so it's sort of like this weird back and forth.
I love that. I love that about the installation. I think that your work is really engaging. It's fun to experience too. I see, for me at least, I feel like it's pretty playful as well. It kind of bounces back and forth between very minimalist and serious, and like, oh, this is serious contemporary art. And then there are moments too that I get in there. I'm like, no, this is so fun. This is very joyful. to come in and see. So thank you so much for sharing it with us and for telling us a little bit about it today. Visitors can come see Bend Breathe by Giulia Levy at the Delaware Contemporary now through May. All of our programs and museum spaces are following strict COVID protocols, but you can also experience our exhibitions online. So Giulia, thank you so much for being with us today. And we hope we get to see everybody at the museum soon.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great talking.